Andrew Torba, the CEO and founder of Gab, recently put out a book called Christian Nationalism, a biblical guide for taking dominion and discipling nations. Now, if you want to get this book for yourself, it's available on Amazon, and bizarrely enough, it's available on Audible in audiobook format. Audible seems to not have a very strict censorship policy, because I was able to get Conservative, and there's a number of other books you wouldn't expect to be on this website on here. So if you want to support Andrew Torba, definitely check it out. So people have been asking me to talk about this and specifically to talk about Academic Agent's response to it. I was just taking a couple days because I wanted to read the book first, and it wasn't very long, so it didn't take me too long to get through it. So before we get into Academic Agent's article, let's just talk a bit about the book itself. Unless I completely missed it, I don't think Torba ever really offers an exact definition of what Christian nationalism is and how it differs from any other kind of nationalism. Just from the way the book is written, though, my understanding of Christian nationalism is the idea that America was founded as an explicitly Christian nation, and that the government should actively be based on Christian principles and promote Christianity as the state religion. Now, within the context of what he means by Christian, he means, I like to call it Christian no denomination specified, as opposed to non-denominational Christianity. He makes pretty clear throughout the book that by Christian, he's including anybody who shares traditional Christian values, believes that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and accepts the Holy Scriptures. So he says, Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants, evangelicals, all fall under his definition, and he's more concerned with creating an America that worships and respects God, particularly in the form of the Trinity, rather than any sort of theological disputes between the different parties. He does, however, exclude churches that have completely given up on traditional social issues such as abortion from his coalition, as he doesn't consider them to be authentically Christian. Beyond that, I'm going to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what the political program is that he's advocating. More or less, it just seems that he wants America to be a Christian society, and he thinks that will resolve a lot of the existing problems. And it's kind of hard. Like, he talks a little bit about how to go about it, but a lot of it's pretty vague and general, and I think it suffers a lot from only being 2 hours long. There's only so much you can really cover if you're talking about like an entire ideological foundation, the practical aspects of it, and the historical precedent in it of a really short book. And I kind of wish that maybe he'd waited a while and fleshed it out a bit more before he just decided to put it out there. But I kind of feel like the book relies very heavily on appealing to people who already share his worldview. Like me reading this, I probably agree about 80% with him in this book. So that kind of overcomes, I think, some of the shortcomings in terms of explaining things or the writing, because I've already am familiar with the material. I don't really know realistically if someone who's not already red pilled, or however you want to describe it, would read this book and get much out of it. The thing that I found the most interesting was when he talked about the historicity of Christianity in America. Something I hadn't really realized is, so most of the colonies initially had a state religion of some description, be that Anglican, Calvinist, Presbyterian, a variety of different things. Now, after America was founded, a lot of those different states abolished having a state church, but most of them at least nominally maintained Christianity as a sort of state religion. So for public offices or to run for office, you were required to swear that you believed in Jesus Christ as the only Son of God, or the inerrancy of the Holy Scriptures, or some other sort of belief in Christianity. The idea that the state was completely secular is largely an invention of the modern era. I think the point, though, is, and I've made this many times myself, you can't really have a specific denomination as the state church of America because the country is very pluralistic. There's a lot of Catholics, there was a lot of Anglicans, there's a lot of evangelicals, Presbyterians, Lutherans. There's all kinds of different denominations. So you can have kind of the idea of a Christian government, but it's not like, say, a country like Italy where Catholicism is the obvious state religion, or some African countries where some sort of evangelical or non-denominational church would probably become this more explicitly the state religion. I think a couple states in the Southeast Pacific are Calvinist because they were uh, evangelized by Calvinist missionaries, and the population's like 90% reformed or something. So, I mean, the book is what it is. I don't think it's particularly coherent. I think he makes a lot of interesting points in it. But like I said, he has no real time to really flesh out or develop any of them. I think Andrew Torba is coming at it from a very good place, and I admire his commitment, and I agree with most of what he says. I just don't think the book is that good, and I'm not going to pretend that it's better than it is just because I might ideologically agree with him. So, that being said, a lot of people have attacked this idea, and in particular, Academic Agent wrote an article, and a lot of people have been asking me to respond to it. So, how am I going to respond to an article that's criticizing this if I wasn't the biggest fan of the original book? Well, most of what he talks about really doesn't have much to do with the book. So, we're going to go into this, and there's just a lot of stuff that is not specific to this. So, let's just go through this. I'm going to admit, and people can believe me or not, I don't really know who Academic Agent is. I think he's involved in NRX or something like that. I hear his name a lot, but I've never actually watched one of his streams. I think he's like a traditionalist libertarian or something. But I think I can judge this based on what he's written here, regardless of what his overall ideology is. I'm just being honest. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on him. Let's go through this. Recently, Andrew Torba released a book called Christian Nationalism, which has sparked a more bitter than usual falling out between the Christian and pagan elements in what is called the Christian right. I mean, I hate to say this, but dude, touch grass. Pagans don't matter. Like, outside of this really narrow autistic sphere of the internet, if you look at like 90% of Christian or maybe not 90%, but a supermajority of people who are in real life who would probably agree with dissident right talking points are going to be Christian, either Catholic or evangelical or Orthodox. If you look at like the percentage of Americans who are predisposed towards it, then like neo-pagans would be like a fraction of a percent. This like pretense that they have any kind of significant role is just a meme brought about by people who spend too much time on the internet. And I do get the irony of that statement, that it applies to me, but it's kind of cringe. It's called Dissident Right, give or take a Pedro Gonzalez Twitter burst. In short, Christians argue Christianity has been vital to the development of Western civilization, while pagans largely blame it for its decline into as a kind of proto-liberalism or even communism. And this is something I always kind of am a bit confused by. As a lot, not all, but a lot of neo-pagans are social liberals on issues like homosexuality or abortion or feminism or monogamy or a lot of things that are generally considered to be anti-liberal. So it always kind of confuses me on this ground. Kind of proto-liberalism or even communism. Furthermore, some pagans such as Mark Brahman have mocked Torba for trying to squeeze Christianity into a nationalist jacket. Brahman has branded Christian nationalism ideologically incoherent. I mean, it is and it isn't. In a lot of cases, when you have a big multicultural society, and I don't mean that in the kind of the cringy sense, America's made up of a lot of different European peoples, Germans, English, Scots, Irish, Italians, Poles, all kinds of people throughout Europe who have different cultures and different religions, but all of them are, at least historically, some form of Christianity. This is something Brazil tried to do. If you look at the Brazilian fascist movement, the integralists, they viewed Catholicism as being the force that would hold together Brazil. That even though Brazil had Afro-Brazilians and European Brazilians and Lebanese Brazilians, Catholicism was kind of the commonality of the identity. Let's see here. This debate has raged for many decades. Actually, it really hasn't. And as such, I do not think it is a fruitful one. In a sense, I want to cut through it by suggesting something almost unthinkable. Religion does not matter to the fate of civilizations. I mean, that's just blatantly untrue. Are we going to argue that religion had no impact on Arab civilization? That without Muhammad, without the ideological conformity that Islam brought to the Arab Peninsula, that the Arabs would have been able to conquer half the world and set up one of the first global empires that stretched from Pakistan to Spain. I mean, according to this, that doesn't matter. That didn't happen, I guess. Actually, it's interesting because one of the points Torba makes in his book is that a lot of colonialism and European exploration was driven by a desire to find more heathens to convert to Christ. And that, if not for the Christian desire for evangelism, what ultimately happened with global empires and global trade might not have occurred. Note that I'm not saying religion does not matter. I am saying that religion does not matter the question of the fate of civilizations. It has long been the paleo-conservative thesis in the Pat Buchanan mold that the decline of the USA and the West more broadly is tied to the loss of its Christian faith. Well, I mean, even if you don't think there's causation, there's certainly correlation. In general, like, the fewer people who go to church, the more, like, paused and degenerate a country is. Like, is it any wonder that mass secularization happened at the same time that we embraced mass immigration, feminism, and all these other things? So even if we argue that there's no causation here, there is most certainly a correlation. France, in particular, became increasingly liberal as the Catholic Church faded from any role in public society. The many books that argued this case include Buchanan's Death of the West and Jim Nelson Black's When Nations Die. In fact, it has been the standard position on the socially conservative right since at least World War II. It is a central thesis on this side of the pond in the work of Peter Hitchens. Peter Hitchens is like not even a conservative. He's like pro-immigration and all this other stuff. I don't even know why he'd mention. Maybe he's like the only person. Yet I ask, how do Buchanan, Black, or Hitchens account for the fact that Thomas Carlyle thought the West to be in its later days as far back as 1850? Or perhaps an even more provocative question, how do any of them account for the details of the table? Okay, let's go through this because there's a lot of stuff to cover here. So it's like, okay, so someone thought that civilization was decline in 1850. I'm going to tell you a secret. Every era has people who think that civilization's in decline. You could go to any century, any year, any point in time, and you will find hundreds of people who will be writing, this is the end of time. I think Adam Smith actually had the best take on this when the American Revolution happened and someone said, the nation is ruined, to which he responded, there is a great deal of ruin in a nation. I mean, there's always a crisis. Like, even when the economy's good, it's not good for some people. So it's like we have to answer something Thomas Carlyle said in 1850 as being authoritative. And then we get into this, and I'm trying to not be mean, but this is kind of a retarded talking point. Like, firstly, we're just taking a table from Wikipedia with no context, and we're going to say here that why isn't, like, the more Christian countries less shitty than some of the less Christian countries, I guess is kind of what the point he's going to get into here. Now, firstly, people will just put Christian down on a census even if they don't go to church. Catholic atheism is a thing. Orthodox atheism is a thing. I'd imagine in countries like Spain, a plurality of the population is probably Catholic atheist. In particular, when it comes to orthodoxy, I'd imagine a plurality of a lot of Eastern European countries are Orthodox atheist or lapsed Orthodox. America is certainly more religiously devout than a lot of the countries on this list. There's also the question of how long these countries have been Christian. So obviously Ethiopia would be the outlier here because it's been Christian for what, like 1500, 1600 years or so. But like Nigeria only became Christian what, like less than 100 years ago? I'm not sure when, because obviously it was colonized prior to that, but I don't know how long until missionaries converted most of it. The Philippines, likewise, I think has only been Christian for 400 or 500 years. I'm not sure how long it took the Spanish to convert all of it. Germany's been Christian for a very long time. So has Russia. So, I mean, you can just throw this out there and have this very, very surface level phase one. But this is kind of an aspect of historical scholarship I really hate. The idea that the specifics of a situation don't matter, that we can just kind of pull out something like this and not look at the specifics of the different groups and try to see, but why is this the case, or is this the case? Anyways, the third most populous Christian nation in the world is the dreaded Mexico, filled with people that many would-be supporters of Christian nationalism would presumably wish to keep out of the US. Why has Christianity failed to produce the 1950s USA so nostalgically remembered by Buchanan and Co. in Mexico or the Philippines? So for this to be accurate, this would have to take the perspective that Andrew Torba, Buchanan, and all these other people only think that Christianity is the only thing that matters in a society, that culture doesn't matter, history doesn't matter, race doesn't matter. None of these things matter except for Christianity. Now, do any of these people, to my knowledge, think that? No. Are we so, like, is the argument here that he thinks Andrew Torba supports unlimited Christian immigration from the third world? Because if he doesn't, it's kind of a straw man. And his complaint that he's going to talk about later is that Andrew Torba didn't talk about immigration in his book on Christian nationalism. But I don't think that was really the focus of the book. So I don't know. You'd have to ask him his opinion of it. I really, really am going to press X to doubt that Andrew Torba wants unlimited Nigerian immigration or something. Let's see here. What has Christianity done to tame the savagery of the Congo? In this article, I'm going to advance the argument that Christianity is a non-factor in the fate of civilizations. Now, to my understanding, in pre-Christian Germany, there was levels of violence comparable to Africa. It was a very brutal place. I know my ancestors, the Vikings, prior to becoming Christian, were really brutal. Engaging in raiding, slavery, mass slaughter, that sort of thing. And over time, it seems that Christianity did civilize the Germanic peoples and they did settle down a lot. But I mean, these things took a long time. You still had, the Normans still practiced concubinage. Like, William the Conqueror was known as William the Bastard because he was the son of a concubine. But within the context of the Normans, that hadn't been fully gotten rid of. There was still aspects of polygamy. There's still aspects of superstition, some syncretic elements that remain. The idea that entire culture is just overnight going to change, and in a lot of cases, it did change. Things like infanticide, rampant divorce, abortion, genital mutilation. I remember one example when I used to listen to Michael Savage. He was talking about when he used to go across the South Pacific, and there was an island he went to where they had a caste of people whose role was to be buried alive under buildings as a form of good luck. And when the missionaries went there, they told them to stop it, and they did stop it. Now, I would consider that would be a good thing, and that would be civilizing the people, but your mileage may vary. The most famous prophet of decline, Oswald Spengler, argued that it was not so much the loss of religious faith that is to blame for civilizational decline, but a rationalistic deconstructive impulse that leads to a loss of creativity and cultural stagnancy. The rationalistic decline phase follows the more vital rise phase as night follows day. Thus, in Spengler, strengthened faith is a byproduct of where you happen to be in the life cycle. Vital at the start when the spirit is animated, but virtually impossible in the rationalistic winter. Okay, we're going to talk about this in a second, but let's just get through this. He inherits this idea from Vico, who posits that after a fall in a barbarian phase, a new cycle would commence with a second religiousness. But in Vico, religion is simply the precondition for civilization. History, in his view, as for Carlyle after him, is driven by divine providence. That means the decline phase in the life cycle, the age of humans, is driven by God as much as the first two phases, the age of gods and the age of heroes. Thus, both in Vico and Carlyle, the manifestation of any particular religion can do nothing but to arrest the tide of history. In Carlyle, God will send a great man, be it Cromwell, be it Mohammed, be it Odin, when the time comes, just as he sent Nebuchadnezzar to destroy Jerusalem in the Bible. So it's just like, I always find this stuff to be just a lot of sophistry. And something we're going to go through the article, and I'm just going to point it out now, is my issue with, and this is one of the main reasons I stopped watching any kind of MRX, is I find very few of these people give their own takes. All they really do is there's a couple people who they quote and say what that person would, what their take would be. Like, I don't mind quoting people, I don't mind exploring the ideas of people, but a lot of this article is just him taking stuff other people said and directly quoting it, and without really adding much to it. And that's just something I don't particularly like. I view history as a very, I don't know, what would the term be, inductionist thing, that I think it's better when you're looking at history rather than reading like these meta narratives that are conjured by people like Spangler. I think it's better to just directly read history and then start to look for commonalities and come to your own conclusions. That tends to be how I go about it. I don't really read that much about historical narrative. I'd rather read like a book on the Elizabethan age or a history book about the early Arabs empires or the Aztecs than I would like Spangler talking about the cycle of civilization. That's just kind of the way I go about it. This is a kind of nascent perennialism in Carlyle, which finds fuller expression in the work of perennial traditionalists such as Julius Evola and Rene Guénon. I don't get the Guénon thing, because Guénon converted to Islam. And these people always complain that Christians don't have a friend-foe distinction. But they're like, oh, this Muslim guy who abandoned Christianity to join the religion that's the biggest opponent of Western civilization. We have to listen to him. We just have to listen to him. We aren't even really going to establish it. And Julius Evola was also like a fucking weirdo. So I've never really seen a reason why these people should be held up as like these paragons of virtue that we should be following. And it's just like, because a lot of them seem to hold Evola and Guénon the same way that Christians hold the Bible. That they're these like transcendent prophets who we have to like worship. They argued what people tend to call religions are really organized esoteric religions which represent faith in their decayed state for the plebeian masses. So basically what Marx said, largely emptied of their esoteric and truly transcendent content. Evola argued that the West accelerated its decline from the fall of the Ghibellines in 1289. Here is a decent summary. Once again, we're just going to quote Evola. Evola saw the Ghibelline dynasty of Hohenstaufen emperors as the Germanic champion of the primordial sacred regality, a renewed Holy Roman Empire. Once the solar, golden, sacred regality of the mystical First Age fell, power devolved upon a lunar, silver, feminized priestly caste before an unconsecrated warrior nobility struggled against it, announcing the Bronze Age. Now, can any of this be empirically proved? Can it be proved that, like, they worship the sun? Like, none of this is really provable. It's just basically fan fiction. It's just, the power shifts to the mercantile class represented by the Italian Commune, Freemasonry, the Jewish financial oligarchy in the Renaissance, and New World American Judo-Protestant plutocracy. By the beginning of the 20th century, organized labor and Marxist Trotskyist subverters sought to transfer power to the last caste of slaves or sudras, or the consumer pariah, reducing all values to matter machines, dysgenic egalitarianism, and the reign of abstract quantity. Now, that's a lot of word salad there, but like something I always hate about Evola and a lot of these people is they presume that you share their worldview, like that you think that the caste system actually exists as like a spiritual necessity, and him saying these people are sudras is like supposed to mean something to you, but it's I guess not. For Evola, the true marker of decline is therefore not whether Christianity or indeed any religion is in the ascendancy, it is whether the solar warrior caste is able to assert dominance over the lunar priestly caste and the ghastly merchant class. Can I get some sort of like citation that they're like sun worshippers? I get that it's a metaphor, but it's just like, who cares? Evola consistently focuses on the transcendent as the guiding stone of capital T traditionalism. His analysis is acutely political rather than religious. It is also racial. My understanding, didn't Evola think that race was a spiritual and not biological thing? I could be wrong. For Evola, the biospirit of European man is in its warrior caste. Indians might be ruled by Brahmins, but Europeans must be ruled by the sword. I don't really think that's how the structure of the caste system worked in India. The Brahmins were the priestly caste, and they were often very poor. They were often like the village monk or the village priest. The Kshatriyas were the ones who actually held temporal power. So I don't really know what he's talking about. At least that's my understanding of how the Indian caste system actually worked. Hence, the Romans were not a martial people because they were pagans, but because they were Romans. Just as the Christian kings of the medieval era were not a martial people because they were Christians, but because they were Teutons. So I guess like Isabella and Ferdinand were German. I hadn't realized that. Or the Greek kings were, or the Byzantine emperors. Heraclius was German. Manuel Comnenus was German. Interesting to know. Of the latter point, I have largely been convinced by Carl Stevenson's medieval feudalism and James C. Russell's The Germanization of Early Medieval Christianity. Christianity adapted to operate under a warrior caste and ceased to be martial practically the second it was allowed to. To use the scientific language of Edward Dunn for a moment, we might say that Christianity's evolutionary advantage is its ability to thrive in particularly any setting. I mean, that's kind of like the first thing he said here that I agree with. Christianity does not posit a specific governmental system, nor does it explicitly ban things that are morally good or morally neutral. It bans traditions that worship other gods or directly go against Christian morality, but a lot of things it just leaves open to interpretation. It doesn't particularly specify it must be a monarchy, it must be a republic, it must be a democracy, it must be an aristocracy. It posits that the state must promote Christianity and promote a certain set of eternal religious and moral precepts. But beyond that, there's a great deal of freedom for interpretation, as opposed to Islam, which is more totalitarian in that it prescribes the use of the Arabic language, Arabic script, in a very specific cultural and legal set of rules. A similar argument made by the man who Bronze Age pervert has dubbed the steampunk father of racism. I don't get why people love Bronze Age pervert. I mean, I can't say what I think about him because this is YouTube, but unlike Evola, de Gibbonow was a committed Christian, but this did not prevent him from pointing out in the inequality of human races that religion, and Christianity in particular, has been neither here nor there when it comes to the rise and fall of civilizations. Also, kind of one of the things that's precedent on this argument, okay, so when Europe was Christian during the medieval era, would they have allowed the refugee crisis? Would Isabella and Ferdinand and Henry VIII and various kings of France, because they were Christian, would that mean that they would have allowed millions of Africans to come to Europe? Would Charlemagne have allowed millions of Africans to come to Europe? No. Now, would the secular modern politicians allow that? Yes. Once again, even if there's no causation, there's certainly a correlation here. Has been neither here nor there. The most sustained argument on the lines. Christians are found in all latitudes and all climates. Statistics inaccurate, perhaps, but still approximately true. Show us a vast number of them. Mongols wandering in the plains of Upper Asia. Savages hiding in the tableland of the Cordilleras. Eskimos fishing in the ice of the Arctic Circle. Even Chinese and Japanese dying under the scourge of the persecutor. The least observation will show this and will also prevent us from falling into the very common error of confusing the universal power of recognizing the truths of Christianity and following its precepts with the very different faculty that leads one human race and not another to understand the earthly conditions of social improvement and to be able to pass from one rung of the ladder to another, so as to reach finally the state which we call civilization. The rungs of this ladder are the measure of the inequality of the human races. There's word salad. Christianity leaves all men as it finds them. The Chinese in his robes, the Eskimo in his furs, the first eating rice and the second eating whale blubber. It does not require them to change their way of life. It didn't at all, guys. It didn't at all. The Romans didn't have rampant divorce prior to Christianity. None of these societies practiced infanticide or human sacrifice or animal sacrifice or permitted transsexualism or practiced polygamy or female genital mutilation or any of these other things. None of that happened according to this. I don't think that is a argument. I think that's very explicitly what he's saying. It does not require them to change their way of life. Now, maybe them saying that means something other than what's written there, and I'm not big-brained enough to understand it, but if their state can be improved as a direct consequence of the conversion, then Christianity will certainly do its best to bring such an improvement, but it will not try to alter a single custom and certainly will not force any advance from one civilization to another, for it has not yet adopted one itself. I mean, that kind of reinforces it. I don't really see how you cannot argue that here he's saying that Christianity did not make civilizations abandon polygamy or infanticide, which is demonstrably untrue. It uses all civilizations and is above all. There are proofs in abundance, and I will speak of them in a moment. Also, isn't the entire concept of universal literacy brought about by Christianity, and in particular Protestantism, based on the idea that everyone should be able to read the Bible? I mean, the idea of valuing universal literacy, to my understanding, is not something you really see in existence prior to when you start to get evangelical Protestants in the 18th and 19th century, particularly in Scotland, but I could be wrong. But I first make the confession that I've never understood the ultra-modern doctrine which identifies the law of Christ in the interests of the world in such a way that it creates from their union a fictitious social order which it calls Christian civilization. It doesn't exist, guys. The ultra-modern doctrine that was established by Constantine in like the 3rd or 4th century. I guess that's like ultra-modern by the standards of this. So we're having to include like ancient Egypt going back to like 6,000 BC or something like that. Like, what is he talking about? Of what importance is the shape of a Christian's house, the cut and material of his clothes, his system of government, the measure of tyranny or liberty of his public institutions? I mean, there is an explicit one with regards to tyranny or liberty. Religious liberty means the freedom to do the right thing and not bad things. He may be a fisherman, a hunter, a plowman, a sailor, a soldier, whatever you like. So it's like his argument that Christianity should force everyone to be a shepherd, to be a legitimate religion. Like, I don't get it. In all these different employments, is there anything to prevent a man, to whatever nation he belong, English, Turkish, Siberian, American, Hottentot, from receiving the light of the Christian faith? Absolutely nothing, and when this result is attained, the rest counts for very little. Um, the savage Gala can remain a Gala, because once again, the claim here, which I think is unarguable, is Christianity did not end a single social practice or change the look. I mean, the fact that Jews and Muslims have huge problems with incest, and there's a whole group of things called Jewish diseases, which come about from exclusive inbreeding. But in Europe, where Christianity explicitly banned incest, with the exception of some cases where the papacy granted dispensations they shouldn't have to certain monarchs, you don't have that issue. That didn't happen, guys. That did not happen. During the 18th centuries that the church existed, it has converted many nations. It began by protesting to the world of antiquity that it did not wish to alter in the slightest degree the outward forms of society. So Christianity was pro-human and animal sacrificing. That's a with an excessive tolerance in this respect, compare, for example, the attitude of the Jesuits towards the Chinese ceremony. I mean, from my understanding, the Jesuits thought that you could adapt some sort of veneration of the ancestors to be compatible with Christian doctrine. Also, I think that the other disagreement was they wanted to allow the Chinese to use Shangdi, I believe it was, which is their name for the primordial creator god, to be used for the Christian god, which is not that weird. I mean, if you look at Japanese, the name for uppercase G god is Kami-sama, if I recall, and Kami is a generic word for God. Even within English, God is a generic term, but uppercase G means God. So it's not that weird a thing. We do not, however, find that a Christianity has ever given the world a unique type of civilization to which all believers belong. The church adapts itself to everything, even to the mud hut, and wherever there's a savage too stupid to even understand the use of shelter, you are sure to find a devoted missionary sitting beside him on the hard rock, and thinking of nothing but how to impress his soul with the ideas essential to salvation. Christianity is thus not a civilizing power in the ordinary sense of the word. It can be embraced by most races without stunting their growth or making demands on them they cannot fulfill. I mean, that's once again demonstrably untrue, and I've addressed that. Most of the tribes of South America were received centuries ago into the bosom of the church, but they have always remained savages with no understanding of the European civilization unfolding itself before their eyes. I'm not surprised that the Cherokees of North America have been largely converted by Methodist missionaries, but it greatly astonishes me if this tribe, while it remained pure in blood, ever managed to form one of the states of the American Union. I mean, like, there's a lot of other things to keep in mind with regards to that. I'm reading a book called Empire of the Summer Moon, I think it's called, about the Comanche. And he points out that civilization and human social order in the New World started developing several thousand years later than it did in the Old World. And the state of development that a lot of these peoples within the Americas were at was kind of equivalent to a much earlier one. So who's to say that in North America, some sort of sedentary civilization would not have developed? The idea here is like these tribes converted to Christianity and then they didn't immediately resemble European civilization within 30 years. So that means it has no influence on it. Also, weren't the Cherokee civilizing at a relatively quick pace? I don't know. But yeah, let's see here. I refer you back to the table, or we might think that Christian nations like Haiti. I'm going to press an X to doubt that Haiti's a Christian nation. It's a lot of weird syncretism. We also have another 107 years of data to check his claim against. We still do not have a single genuine success story in either Africa or South America. Guys, Chile is not a success story. Uruguay is not a success story. I understand Argentina has its problems, but it's also not a success story. Let's see here. Dr. Gobineau argued that the hard racialist position that the decisive factor for determining the level of civilization is race. White race produces civilizations. Black and yellow races do not without a significant helping hand for whites. For him, the whites include the people from across the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent, but find their most pure expression in the Nordics. So we're quoting like some retarded Nordicist now. That's who you should listen to. And I say this as someone who's from a Nordic background, a German, Anglo, Norman background. My people were living in huts and acting like retards when the Romans and Greeks were building the great civilizations of the ancient world. It's really, a lot of it is just cope. Admixture results always in a leveling down, although it can help raise the lower race. We do not necessarily need to argue with the analysis arguments about Christianity hold. For example, personally, I find his arguments about China's near total neglect of Japan dubious. When considering the yellow races, he tends to focus on other places. I mean, that's what, like 90% of the Asians there. He says, quoting Carl Ritter, that the Siamese are the most shameless people in the world. They are the lowest point in Indo-Chinese civilization, and yet they can all read and write. Apparently, universal literacy existed in Thailand in the pre-modern period. Let me see here. Okay, the quote here is just from a book, so I can't look it up. But I'm going to assume that that quote proves that there was universal literacy in Thailand, that they did a census in like the 18th century or something and somehow figured that out. Let's see here. Incidentally, reject education as a factor in civilization too. One is reminded of the fact that Cuba famously has a literacy rate of 99.75%. If we're going to assume Cuba has accurate statistics and the communist government doesn't make them up. To see the truth of the negative side, however, one does not have to examine his extreme racism. There's clearly a factor other than Christianity determining the fate of nations. Christians put it above, okay, let's see here. Religions other than Christianity, even though seemingly disruptive in the worldly sense is Islam, whether it's Islam spectacularly failed Turks to stop being Turks, Arabs being Arabs, and Iranians being Iranians. The relationship between these three peoples has been mutually antagonistic for thousands of years. Is that necessarily the case? I thought the Middle East was fairly placid under the Ottomans for most of its existence, and for all intents and purposes remain practically unchanged today. The Islamization of Iran happened 633 to 654. Arab conquerors made every attempt to impose the Arabic language on the Persians. They failed utterly to do so utterly that by 1010, I mean, the Abbasids. This is true. The Umayyads attempted to forcibly Arabize a lot of the areas they conquered. Arab high culture was not particularly strong, so when the Abbasids overthrew the Umayyads, it was what I like to call an Islamic culture that was primarily Persian in nature with Arabic characteristics. But is that necessarily a failure of Islam, or is that just the fact that that Iran had a more developed high culture in terms of literature, artwork, that sort of thing? Once again, we're looking at a very simplistic way of looking at the world. I'm just going to scroll down because this is kind of boring. Why dwell on this issue? It is to recognize that the nature of our struggle is political, which is to say worldly as much as it is spiritual. The spiritual struggle is the one we all face against the daily humiliations of the modern world. Constant attacks on all that is decent, constant attacks on our people, and above else, against the constant lure of nihilism. Christianity cannot be reduced to a mere utility. It is more than whatever. Must finally resolve always in affirming in the name of Jesus Christ. But in so much as it has a narrow purpose for a struggle, it may provide men and women with the steel required in their spiritual battle against modernity. However, as it argued for the political struggle, it is and will always be neutral. The famous phrase from the Bible is "Render unto Caesar." Thus, when in Rome, the Christians lived as Romans. In fact, that phrase "when in Rome" was a Christian origin. Saint Ambrose advice to Saint Augustine. The conversion of the Roman Emperor to Christianity was not achieved by political struggle, but rather through birth rates and other purely evolutionary means, as well as a litany of errors on the part of the Roman elite. So Constantine converted to Christianity because of the birth rate of Christians in the Roman Empire. I mean, is that unfair? I think that's what he's saying. Let's see. I'm just going to scroll down. See here. I do not say these things to divide, but rather to clarify and do what I have always done. See things as they are and not how they ought to be, by looking at it through the context of Gunan and Evola. But let's suppose you accept all I have said thus far. Does this invalidate the political movement that Torba is trying to spearhead in contemporary America? In other words, could Christian nationalism work in America to foment a resurgence of its national character, as Twelver Shia Islam has done for Iranian since Ismaili I? Declare the time for lukewarm Christianity is over. What do they mean? Christianity may form for heritage Americans, which is to say white Americans, a bulwark against their traditional enemies, Muslim and Jews, since there are relatively few Muslims in America, and they are not yet a serious political force as they are in Europe. The real political aim of Christian nationalism, scarcely even veiled, is a method of combating the influence of organized Jewish groups in a way that definitively excludes them. Does this have any hope of succeeding? Time will tell, I suppose. But in the short term, Torba and friends have some significant hurdles to overcome, and much more significant than the snipes of counter signals of the non existent pagan white nationalists. The first hurdle, ironically, is the Christians themselves, especially those of the evangelical Zionist stripe. I mean, that is a problem, and it's a problem that needs to be addressed. It is a big issue. I'm not deny that, although this seems like it's a very small sample size. Isn't that 3 out of 100 people? Do not believe in God percentage. Oh, okay. It's just kind of weird the way that it's worded. Let's see here. Let me just scan through this. Let's see here. Struggle to see how Christian nationalism is going to make a difference. Being Christian has done little to nothing for race relations in America, as being Islamic has helped Arabs, Turks, and Iranians get along in the Middle East. As far as I can see, it will do absolutely nothing to prevent the racial reckoning that America's future inevitably holds. My view, as many readers will know, is that the US is doomed because of its total inability to address its racial problems. In closing, let us ponder this question. Why was North America a relative success up until recently, and South America a total basket case? Gibbenow, who from his vantage point of 1855 could not have known for sure how the next 170 years ago would go, provides one answer. In Spanish America, less aversion is felt by the natives towards their masters. The reason is that they were formerly left by the central government under the rule of their caciques. The government did not try to civilize them, it allowed them to keep their own laws and customs. And provided they became Christians, merely required them to pay tribute. There was no question of colonization. Once the conquest was made, the Spanish showed a lazy tolerance to the conquered, and only oppressed them spasmodically. This is why the Indians of South America are less unhappy than those of the North, and continue to live on, whereas the neighbors of the Anglo-Saxons will be pitilessly driven into an abyss. The Anglo-Saxons did not do that because they are Christians, but because they are Anglo-Saxons. But because they're Anglo-Saxons, that has brought us to this point. The only way out is to become pitiless once more, lest it will be you and your people driven into the abyss. So, Mark Brahman is our hero. I guess he's the new leader of the White Race. So I think I covered most of the aspects of this. People can say I'm nitpicking, but I think most of what I said is like a direct response to things that he said. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I don't really have too much to say about it. That was my attempt to kind of respond to some of this. Hopefully you found it interesting. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Once again, like I said, I don't really know anything about Academic Agent. People just sent me this article and asked me to comment on it. And so I did that. God bless everyone. I'll talk to you all later.